Many people in the Western Cape are very unhappy with the trajectory of South Africa. So unhappy that some of them are getting together to advocate for Cape independence. This is a controversial idea, but I thought I would bring in Phil Craig of the Cape Independence Advocacy Group to discuss this topic. Phil, welcome to Solutions with David Ansara.
Thank you, David. Thank you very much for having me on, and it's a pleasure to be here.
Could you tell us more about your personal background and also the Cape Independence Advocacy Group? How did it come about, and what are some of its objectives?
Look, I got involved as an individual person who could see that the future for South Africa was not as rosy as it should be. We could see the storm clouds on the horizon, and we wanted to find solutions. I'd always felt that Cape Independence was probably going to be a natural counterpoint to increasing African nationalism in the rest of the country. Although, funnily enough, it became apparent that wasn't really going to happen naturally, and we were always waiting for somebody else to after up. I then got involved myself at the beginning of 2020, after having had discussions with several of the independence groups, with some like-minded people, we decided that nobody exactly represented what it was that we wanted to do. And we got together and we formed the CIAG in April 2020. That's when we launched the CIAG. What's our mission? I think probably my background is in marketing, sales and marketing, and therefore my approach to Cape Independence was very much a marketing approach. And my initial starting point is, well, look, what do we need to do to deliver Cape Independence? And I felt a lot of the other groups perhaps hadn't really got that covered, and we set about saying, well, look, how do we create the conditions that are likely to bring Cape Independence about? And our sort of two primary aims really were to get Cape Independence established in the media, so that people were talking about Cape Independence and it developed as an option. And then to influence the sort of positions of political parties and political actors towards Cape Independence. They were our two primary aims. And look, obviously, we part of that was supporting the other existing groups who were pushing for Cape Independence. So that really is our role to promote Cape Independence as a discussion point, to influence political parties and actors, and then to support other people as best we can in their work towards Cape Independence.
Okay, Phil, so the CIAG is not a political party per se, but you're a lobby group. And the objective is Cape Independence. But what about the why? Simon Sinek wrote the book Start With Why. So what is your why? What is the underlying principle here? Why are you trying to achieve Cape Independence?
So I think because we've got problems that aren't going to be fixed. I had the privilege of speaking at the press club earlier in the year, and the topic was what's driving support for Cape Independence, and we summed it up with one sentence. That we've got a problem that Cape Independence can fix when nothing else will, and I think that kind of sums it up in a one-liner. What is the issue? Well, the people of the Western Cape have, for 30 years, the majority of voters in the Western Cape have never had the government they voted for, and they have no reasonable prospect of ever getting the government they vote for. So in terms of just democracy for the people of the Western Cape, there's a problem, and you have to have a chance of electing the government you want, and if you can't for decades upon end, then clearly there is an issue, and it's not a benign issue given how poor the performance of the government that has been elected by the other provinces. So I think that's really sort of start off with democracy. And I think we tag on to that then the ideology, and I think the Western Cape, as can be demonstrated from its voting record, clearly has different views to the rest of South Africa, and we see one set of solutions. South Africa sees a different set of solutions. I'm not sure South Africa actually sees any solutions, but it thinks it sees a different set of solutions. Therefore, if you respect democracy, you have to respect the right of the rest of the people in South Africa to elect the government they want. But we don't really feel any urge to go down with the ship. And given that we're not voting for that, and we never really have voted for that. That's Cape Independence in a nutshell. We'd love to save South Africa. We can't. It's not up to us. But actually, we want to be sure as hell want to make sure we save the Western Cape where we live and where we are the voters.
Okay, so you're focusing local and trying to distance yourself from some of the more harmful policies emanating out of Pretoria. But now, Phil, what do people of the Cape think about this idea of Cape independence? Is there support for what you're doing?
Well, they're warming rapidly to the idea. So I think first of all, we've just polled. This is our second poll, and the results are very, very encouraging for us. And I think probably the two most telling statistics are that 58% of the people of the Western Cape would now like to see a referendum on Cape independence. So that's a very, very significant number. And I think that has to be taken into context with 58% want a referendum. And the DA have already announced that they're going to fix the referendum legislation. Those two things clearly aren't unrelated. The DA have come to the referendum questions as a result of political pressure within the province, because people are wanting change, and Cape independence is gaining momentum. So we've got 58% wanting a referendum on Cape independence, and at last check we've got 46.2% of registered voters in the Western Cape supporting the idea of Cape independence. So not only have we got the majority wanting a referendum, but I mean we are very, very close now to getting a majority of people to support Cape independence. So I think there's a lot of support. And what's been very, very encouraging in this second poll from our first poll is we've seen a significant growth amongst registered voters that increased from 34% to 46% in a 12-month period. And all of that growth has come amongst coloured and black voters, which is really positive, because we understand that, given South Africa's history, there is more hesitancy, or there was more hesitancy amongst the groups that were sort of previously discriminated against. So from our point of view, that has been really, really encouraging. And across the racial groups, 65% of white voters want Cape independence, 50% of coloured voters now want Cape independence, and 22% of black voters want Cape independence.
Okay, so in terms of the methodology for this polling, Phil, because I'm sure many of our viewers will be asking about that, the sample size was about 886, is that correct? And the margin of error, was that about 4%, you said?
Correct. Yeah, I was at 886 sample size and a 4% margin for error. The poll was conducted by Victory Research.
Okay, yeah, and they're a well-known polling company in South Africa. All right, Phil, so the DA has tabled this private members bill to amend the Referendums Act, and we had an episode with Richard Wilkinson on federalism, which we'll link to here, that discussed this process in more detail. So if anyone's interested, they can go and watch that. But essentially, would you see this Cape independence question being included on a referendum? Is that your ultimate objective? And how would this process play out?
Yeah, look, it definitely is our objective, and actually our expectation, if I'm honest. I think how this is going to play out. First of all, we've got the passage of bill through Parliament, and I think there are a lot of moving parts. So clearly there's a degree of speculation on my part. But first of all, I expect that the bill will pass Parliament. Clearly, the right to hold the referendum is already included in both the National and the Western Cape Constitution, and therefore Parliament will have to sort of go against the South African Constitution, which would then force a motion to the Constitutional Court, and it may delay the inevitable. So I think probably, my expectation is that the ANC will choose not to fight that battle, because I'm not sure it would be a battle that would be very beneficial to them. So I think that this legislation is going to be passed fairly quickly, and I think that's also the DA's expectation. And I think once it's been passed, the DA absolutely intends to call referendums in the Western Cape. I think what's on the question paper is up for debate, but the Referendums Act, or the Referendums Act as was, the DA's private members bill actually seeks to repeal the Referendums Act and to sort of amalgamate it into the Electoral Commissions Act. What that allows for is multiple question referendums, that and that's what I'm expecting to see, a consultation referendum, probably, let's call it that, between the people of the Western Cape and the Western Cape government. And I think that's going to include questions on a number of things, and I think Cape independence inevitably is going to be one of those. I think it would be almost impossible for the DA not to include the Cape independence question. 65% of their own voters want a referendum on Cape independence. Independence. 58% of all voters in the province want. So if you are the elected government, your name is the Democratic Alliance, and everybody wants a referendum on Cape Independence. You're going to have to make a very strong argument to say, well, hang on a second, we know better than everybody, and we're going to go our own way and ignore the democratic will of just about everybody. So I expect us to see a referendum on Cape Independence, yes, but probably not just on Cape Independence.
And so, Phil, you're obviously lobbying political parties. How have various political parties responded to this question? We did actually have Helen Ziller on Solutions with David Ansara, and I put it to her that, this Cape Independence question is growing. And, she said that, well, in terms of her view and the party's view, was that this would be unrealistic, that it would require policing a very long border, and that the act of secession would also potentially trigger some kind of civil war or a civil conflict. What is your response to the way that political parties have engaged with this issue?
Look, I think for the most part, political parties have engaged fairly well. So I think we have to understand that what political parties say and what political parties do aren't always exactly the same thing. The Cape Independence is an issue that isn't primarily been led by political parties, which puts it in a slightly strange situation for political parties. It's a movement that's been driven by ordinary people and by civic organizations as opposed to any significant political party. So the political parties are being forced to react to the people, and that creates a different set of circumstances to which many of the political parties are used to working. So for the DA, there's a degree of uncomfortableness around Cape Independence, and I think initially they really didn't know what to do or say. I think of late, the last few months, they've sort of started to sort of consolidate around a position. And I think what we've seen with the DA is they are trying to temper Cape Independence into greater autonomy. They've always supported federalism. 18 months ago, they certainly wouldn't have been talking about federalism, but suddenly they are, and they're talking about greater autonomy, and they've now brought the referendums bill. And I think the DA and the Cape Independence movement aren't very far apart, but clearly we would want them to go further than they currently have gone, and they would want us to sort of dial it back a little bit while we find each other. But the DA for the most part have been willing to engage, and let's just say are fully engaged in terms of the space. They understand the political significance of Cape Independence. They understand that it's something that they can't now wave away, and of course they're making counter arguments. I think some of those arguments I could argue against them if we want to. I don't really think they're genuine arguments. I think the DA can't come out and say we support Cape Independence, so therefore they have to say something. So we end up with these sort of slightly side issues of how are you going to man the border and what are you going to do about this, and but I don't really see those as genuine issues. I don't think the DA is ideologically opposed to Cape Independence. I think they've got some practical issues. 70% or 69% of their voters are based outside of the Western Cape, and interestingly enough, I think with the DA, I don't think they understand themselves how their voters outside of the Western Cape feel, and I think it's something that we intend to poll, because we certainly have a strong suspicion, anecdotal I must say, that that DA voters outside of the Western Cape are also very keen on Cape Independence, and if we look as an organisation, many of our most ardent supporters and sponsors and are outside of the Western Cape, because I think they understand that the problems that are facing South Africa almost better than those people that are sheltered in the Western Cape, and they understand the need for a solution, and I think kind of a part of South Africa that is ideologically sound and functional is beneficial to everyone. So that's the DA. For other parties, obviously the Freedom Front have now formally come on board and are out and out for Cape Independence. We've got smaller parties like the Cape Party who've always been for Cape Independence. So the Cape Coloured Congress have got Cape Independence in their manifesto, although at times they're a bit contradictory in the things they say. So technically we've got those parties pushing for it. And we're starting to see amongst other parties a real softening. So I think what you're seeing is a real movement around greater greater autonomy, that and that's something that that is happening on a almost a monthly basis. There are changes. This whole, let's call it a train towards greater autonomy, is picking up steam and momentum, and as soon as we've got political momentum, of course the political actors want to get on board, and that's exactly what we're seeing behind the scenes.
So, Phil, I mean, I've long been an advocate of federalism. I think that decentralization is a really important value. And the opposite of that is centralization. And what tends to happen is the more a state centralizes activities, the more unresponsive it becomes to the needs of citizens on the ground. And certainly there are many threats in terms of government policy. We currently have expropriation without compensation being debated. There is also the way in which the COVID crisis has been handled. There's talk of national health insurance. These are significant risks. And of course, we have the recent memory of the July riots in KZN, which showed the incapacity of the state to maintain basic law and order. And we've had a couple of episodes on that, most notably with Gideon Joubert, which we'll link to here. But, I think, one of the risks that I see is that you could potentially trigger off a kind of a disaggregation of South Africa that becomes quite chaotic, and where you have particularly fractures along kind of ethnic lines or racial lines. Is this a risk that you have taken into account, and what would be your response to those concerns?
Well, look, yes, it's something that we've considered, and look, I would argue that South Africa is quickly becoming dysfunctional anyway, and is heading towards crises. And I think we all, certainly my perception, and I think probably most people's too, would be that KZN was just a tinderbox which had a spark thrown into it, and we've managed to put out the fire for now. But the tinderbox is still there. We've got chronic levels of unemployment, we've got chronic levels of inequality, we've got high levels of poverty, and those things are getting worse rather than better, and rather than pursuing policies that will remedy them, we're doubling down on the policies that caused the problems in the first place. So there aren't any solutions on the ground waiting. So I would argue that South Africa is in for a rough ride, and I think Cape Independence is a solution to that, as opposed to something that's going to aggravate it. I do think Cape Independence is probably going to spur on the breakup of South Africa, and I think for much of the reasons that we talked about there, I think the breakup of South Africa in any case is inevitable. All we don't know is how and when it's going to break up, and whether it's Frans Cronje's enclave society, or whether it's a more formalized breakup of power in the way that we think, or even other solutions. Whether that turns into a confederal SADC, or there are all sorts of possibilities there. I do think Cape Independence is going to be a catalyst for change, but I think we desperately need change. When it comes to the ethnic part of it, the Western Cape is the most ethnically diverse province in South Africa, and I think so certainly Cape Independence isn't ethnic in nature, and one of the things that probably is one of the most positive aspects of Cape Independence is that living in a society where one race has always dominated another on the basis of ethnicity, and that's just generally been unhelpful throughout. Cape Independence promises a society where you have three dominant ethnic groups, none of who hold an outright majority. So therefore, it's going to be very difficult in an independent Cape for any one race to dominate any other races, because the other two races will have a majority if one tries. And I think that will probably make for a far more stable society than we currently have in South Africa.
And Phil, I mean, I noted on your website as well that you state that non-racialism is a core value, and it's one of the few principles that you put forward. So I think we also have to take you on face value on that. And it also reminds me of the very long liberal tradition that was mostly centered in the Cape. In 1852, I think it was, the Cape Constitution included franchise for colored men to enable them to vote. There was a condition there. It was a conditional franchise. They needed to own property. And then that right was subsequently taken away after the Union of South Africa. The Cape Colony lobbied in London to have that franchise included, and ultimately that interest was discarded. So, I think the Cape liberal tradition is something to also reflect on and to try to preserve as well.
No, look, and yeah, the lobby in many ways, I find that particularly I lobbied in London. That was of course the Schreiner Commission, and in many ways that's quite that's quite an inspiring thing for the CIAG. It was Abdullah who was coloured, it was Javabu rather who was black, and it was Schreiner who was white, and the three collectively went to London and pleaded for a non-racial Cape Colony or Cape Territory. Are we not back right at the same place 110 years later? Here we are in South Africa. We had our press conference last week, and then we sat at the table, one coloured guy, one white guy, one black guy, pleading for a non-racial Western Cape. Here we are, and in between that 110 years have been a mess racially. Perhaps now we can get that right. Non-racialism is absolutely fundamental to everything we do, and I think it's one of those funny situations where in South Africa the non-racists are painted out as the racists and the racists as the non-racists. We've got this topsy-turvy world, and we saw that when the DA tried to come out and made non-racialism a policy. And people forget that non-racialism is a founding principle of the South African Constitution. So we've got the founding principle of the South African Constitution. The official opposition adopts the founding principle of the South African Constitution and is rounded upon and lambasted from all sides. And that is the crazy world that we're living in. So we don't hide from anything. We understand there are race issues in South Africa, and we don't have a magic wand, and they aren't going to magically disappear with Cape independence. But non-racialism is absolutely fundamental to an independent Cape. And actually, South Africa is the place that's got the issue with racism, not the Western Cape.
Well, yeah, and I would take that further and say it's South African politicians who have the problem with race, and ordinary South Africans, as we have shown in the Centre for Risk Analysis, they tend to be a lot more moderate, to be a lot more charitable towards people of different races and ethnic groups. But it's the ethnic entrepreneurs of politicians who mobilize along those divisive grounds.
Sure.
But Phil, could we turn the conversation now towards policy? And sure. You've spoken about some of the principles, but how would the independent Cape differentiate itself in terms of policy? What would be some of those policy issues that you would like to see put forward?
So look, people often struggle with this because we were an organisation who don't have policies, and people find that strange. But ultimately, the founding principle of us is that the people of the Western Cape have to elect the government. And actually, the Cape Independence Advocacy Group is a cross-political movement. So even amongst the leaders of our organisation, we hold quite diverse political views. And what we agree on is that the people of the Western Cape must be able to elect a government, and they must be able to hold that government to account. Once we get to Cape independence, it may well be that the leaders of our organisation end up in different political parties and perhaps even opposing each other, and that's fine. We just want to have a functional democracy. So in terms of policy per se, we only actually have two policy positions. We have a policy position on non-racialism, and we have a policy position on where the border must be, because we feel that people can't decide whether they're for or against Cape independence if they don't know those two things. But beyond that, we don't have policy positions. What we do have, clearly, we have, if we liked the policy positions of South Africa, we wouldn't need Cape independence. And I think what we can look at is the 30 years worth of voting history of the Western Cape, and we can see that the Western Cape broadly leans towards a more free market system. I personally like the DA's social market economy. I think we have to create a market economy that creates jobs and allows businesses to thrive and encourages entrepreneurship. But we also have to be cognizant of the fact that we have incredible inequality, we have great poverty, we have people living living in shacks, and those things need to be addressed. And we can't just start again and say, oh well, look, bad luck, this is where you are. We have a responsibility to make things better. So, from a personal perspective, and not speaking for the organisation, I would want to see policies that would start to address that. And I think clearly, there were people in our organisation who perhaps would err more towards the sort of free market side. But yeah, they're just our two policies. We trust the people of the Western Cape, and the people of the Western Cape have shown over 30 years that their judgment is immensely better than the judgment of the people in the other 8 provinces. Perhaps that's a very partisan thing to say. But I'm going to say it anyway.
And where would you want the border to be?
Well, the border has to start at the Western Cape border, and I think that that doesn't necessarily mean that it ends up being at the Western Cape border, but we understand through the sort of the international conventions that you must have a defined territory, a defined population, a defined government, and we have all of those things in the Western Cape. We've got a border that already exists, we've got a government that already exists, that population is defined, we've got electoral records for them, we know how we know how they voted, we know who's on the voters' roll, so therefore for all of those reasons we have to start at the Western Cape. I think once let's project forward and say, right, we have a referendum, and the Western Cape government gets a mandate from the people of the Western Cape to negotiate independence from South Africa. I think we can take as read that people on the other side of the border who would also be, let's say, voting for the DA as opposed to the ANC are likely to start wanting to throw their lot in with the Western Cape too. And we would hope that the democratic process could be put in place to allow them to do that, and perhaps that would be referendums at municipal level. I don't know, but I mean that then we're on speculation from our point of view. Step one is a referendum in the Western Cape in line with the existing constitutional provisions to give the provincial government of the Western Cape a mandate to negotiate independence from South Africa.
Okay, so let's do a thought experiment. Say this referendum goes ahead and the people of the Western Cape overwhelmingly vote yes in favor of independence. Now you have to negotiate with the central government in Pretoria, and you reach an impasse and they just say, well, we're not going to accept this. What happens then?
Look, I think that probably is a very likely first step, and I think I've come in my time in South Africa to hear the expression that everybody talks about the ANC, which is the balance of political forces, and in many ways we end up right back at the reverse of the end of apartheid. We have a government that's intransigent, and we have a group of people who are striving for democracy and freedom from the government that effectively is imposing their will. And I think this is one of the interesting scenarios, if we're hypothetical, is let's imagine the people of the Western Cape make it absolutely clear that they no longer want to be part of South Africa, and that the ANC isn't the government that they want. And we know from 30 years have never voted for the ANC. Obviously, they had a minority government. So let me rephrase that: the majority have never voted for the ANC. So now we have the government in Pretoria saying, well, look, actually, we don't really care. It doesn't matter what the majority of people in the Western Cape want. It doesn't matter what they've ever wanted. We are going to force our will onto the people of the Western Cape against their will. And from Pretoria, we are going to project our political power over a territory. Well, they've become the colonial power. They've become everything that they hated. And I think that's one of the interesting things with Cape Independence is what underpins Cape Independence is in many ways the founding principles of the ANC. We want democracy, we want self-determination, and we want non-racialism. So are we not fighting for exactly the things that they were fighting for? And I think that so when we have that thing, I think that's something that's going to play out quite significantly with the ANC. They really are going to have to go against every principle they claim to stand for to suppress the democratic will of the Western Cape. And more than that, so I think then what happens next, so we end up in this situation now, all of a sudden the ANC becomes the pariahs of the world and forcing their will down on somebody, and the Western Cape becomes the beleaguered ideological minorities who are now are oppressed against their will. The Western Cape now turns to the outside world and starts to look for support for its cause, to ramp up pressure on South Africa, to allow South Africa to respect the democratic wishes of the Western Cape ideological minority. And we're right back in a position that we're very familiar with. And I have had a number of conversations now with foreign politicians and foreign journalists and so on. And one of the things that's been quite remarkable is just how, and perhaps surprisingly so, just how easily people from outside South Africa get it. They've watched. We think they haven't seen, and they perhaps don't understand all the nuances, but they understand well enough what's going on in South Africa. They understand that actually it's suicidal, and they completely grasp why a territory wouldn't want, who never voted for it, wouldn't want to blindly go along with that just to be part of some colonial construct that's 100 years old. Why would they? So I've often thought it would be much harder to convince overseas politicians to support Cape Independence, and every conversation I have just buoys me to think, well, okay, foreign support is not going to be very hard to get as long as we've done it democratically.
And what about international examples of independence movements? I'm thinking the Scottish independence movement. There was the referendum in 2014. They want to leave the United Kingdom. There was in Spain, in Catalonia, the Catalans want to leave as well. They had a referendum themselves in 2017, which was deemed illegal. Many of their leaders were put in prison. So I mean, it seems that the world is heading towards this kind of direction as well, Phil. People want greater levels of subsidiarity, localization, and in many ways, there is a kind of a tide that is sweeping the world along in this direction. What are your reflections on the international environment?
Well, I think, look, so the first and foremost is people kind of think, gosh, secession is this radical idea, but actually it's the history of the world. Borders and countries are in constant flux, and most of the countries that we think of, have seceded in one form or another. That's how they came into being. So secession isn't some once-off odd event. It's part of the normal ebbs and flows of international politics and countries coming and going. I think if we talk about current examples, there's a couple you mentioned there, and I think Scotland is one we look at a lot, perhaps because I'm British by birth, and I understand the dynamics of that one perhaps better than others. But in many ways, it's the gold standard of how democratic governments should perform. You had a situation where there was a rise in support for Scottish nationalism. It hadn't by any means got to a majority, but actually the national government in the UK recognised this. They granted a referendum. Actually, they granted a binding referendum to the people of Scotland, and they allowed they allowed both sides to campaign. They allowed the democratic process to unfold, and they agreed to abide by the outcome. And look, I would love to think that we could have that in South Africa. I think that's probably less likely. But I mean, that would be the perfect scenario. And as it turned out, Scotland voted to remain rather than to leave, and people then sort of lose sight of that. But it doesn't really. The outcome is irrelevant. The process was fantastic, and I would love that we followed that process. If we look at something like Quebec, that probably is more similar to the South African scenario where the referendum was non-binding. And therefore you were going to have a mandate for independence for Quebec, but then there would still need to be a negotiation there afterwards. And I think that probably is how we're going to end up in the Western Cape and in South Africa. And then the other one you mentioned was Catalonia, and of course with Catalonia it's a slightly different situation. And in many ways, Catalonia, they just played their cards wrong. I think Catalonia, I would absolutely love to put myself in Catalonia's shoes. To have a million people on the streets, to have overwhelming support. It's much easier in many ways for them because they have a much more homogeneous population than us in the Western Cape. So, they really had the perfect set of circumstances to build up, but they just rushed it. They ended up calling a referendum, which was then declared illegal by the Constitutional Court, and they held the referendum anyway. And so they just went about it unfortunately in the wrong way, which and then they made a unilateral declaration of independence, and then they got themselves arrested and so on and so forth. So, I think probably they just made a few errors there. But I mean, the interesting thing is, Scottish independence and Catalonian independence are by no means done deals. We've just got back around the cycle. With Scotland is pushing very hard now for another referendum in the wake of Brexit, and Catalonia is still getting support for independence up in the mid-40s. So neither have gone away.
And Phil, there's also a countervailing force, which is supranational organizations like the European Union, for example, which tends to also become very bureaucratized, very static, and also imposes a lot of rules and are characterized by a lack of accountability. So I think it's interesting to see that those two trends are in tension.
Yeah, and look, and I think organisations like the EU are it's difficult because you actually got both things wrapped up in one organisation. So I mean the EU is one of the best examples of confederalism, where you've got nationality. Let's call it your nationality exists at a provincial level, but actually you collaborate and work together. And I think in the early days the EU was very, very successful, and people were fighting to get into to the EU. I think it lost its way, and I think I guess they were probably the power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. I think that probably is we ended up with a whole load of bureaucrats and policies that didn't really make very much sense, and that was the story of Brexit. A loss of sovereignty. The idea of the EU is you're supposed to have sovereignty at a national level, and increasingly that wasn't the case. That was actually Brussels was ruling by diktat and the ordinary people. But I mean, Brexit in many ways is not dissimilar to the Western Cape. At Cape Independence, you had a movement that initially was driven by people and civic organisations as opposed to political parties, and actually they also then the Conservative Party became the Trojan horse that delivered Brexit in much the same way that the DA is going to be the Trojan horse that delivers Cape Independence.
Yeah, I find it funny how the Tories were ultimately dragged along by the Brexiteers, and then had this muddled Brexit process, but were ultimately champions of it. But then Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister, is now saying, no, I don't want to oversee the breakup of the United Kingdom, and I don't want to see Scotland do what we did to the EU. So I find that quite ironic. But maybe as we bring the conversation to a close, Phil, what's the next steps for the CIAG? What are you going to be doing in the short term to try to realize your longer term vision?
Well, look, I think in terms of what steps next, it's fair. Yeah, we tried to keep things pretty simple. First of all, we have to get the referendum, and in our mind, the referendums are more or less done. At the end of the day, we've got to keep the DA's feet to the fire politically, and we mustn't let them get too comfortable. But at this point in time, the DA are going to call referendums, and I think there's an extraordinarily high likelihood that that's going to include Cape Independence, because apart from anything else, our polling once again confirmed that if they oppose Cape Independence, they would potentially lose their majority in the Western Cape and be forced into coalitions. And and the Freedom Front are just waiting in the wings, hoping that some of these crumbs drop from the table. The Cape Party too, but I know the Freedom Front have now come out openly, actually as have the Cape Party, so let's put both together. The Freedom Front and the Cape Party have both openly said if we would go into a coalition with the DA, but the terms of our coalition would be a referendum on Cape Independence. So I think the DA is boxed into a corner and is going to have little choice but to call a referendum on Cape Independence, and our job is just to keep the pressure on until it happens. And I think we're going to see that referendum within the next 2 years. what happens after that. And I think that's always been the biggest obstacle. And I think I said at the start, my background is marketing. And the biggest challenge is winning the referendum, and it remains so. So that is really the big. So whilst we've got to keep the DA's feet to the fire and make sure we get the referendum, that's more or less a job done. What we really have to focus our efforts on now is building up a good base for a solid vote to leave campaign, so that when the referendum comes, that we deliver the mandate that we need. And that probably is our biggest task. And clearly we have to have then one eye beyond that, and to continue with our discussions with political actors, both internally and externally, so that once we've got a mandate, we're in a position to negotiate effectively. But winning the referendum is the be all and the end all. People often talk about, if you get a convincing mandate, there's never going to be a 60% support for Cape independence. That's not going to happen. Our best chance has always been 52-53%, which makes it very marginal, and we're going to have to work extraordinarily hard to get Cape independence, and that has to be our primary focus.
Well, I think this has some pretty significant implications, not just for the people of the Western Cape, but also for South Africa as a whole, and the very idea of South Africa. And sure, we've spoken about that period in 1910, and that was the Act of Union. And in many ways, Cape independence might be the act of disunion for the rest of South Africa. And what that means is pretty uncertain. But as you say, the South Africa that we have at the moment is not working terribly well, and we need to come up with some pretty innovative solutions for how to solve those problems. That might be Cape independence, it might be greater levels of federalism and autonomy for the various regions and people of South Africa, but we will have to see how it goes.
Yeah, and I think, look, the interesting thing, and we've mentioned federalism a couple of times, and we aren't ideologically opposed to federalism, but we're pragmatically opposed to it. And I think, what for us, there are key questions. What do you need to save South Africa? What do you need to save a part of South Africa? They're both the same thing, whether it's South Africa that you're saving or the Western Cape or the Northern Cape. What do you need? And what you need is control of economic policy. First and foremost, you need a few other things, law and order. You need to have a judiciary that's independent and so on. But the absolute critical requirement is that you must have control of economic policy, because if you can't control your economic policy, then you simply aren't going to save South Africa. And that would be our biggest argument against federalism. At the end of the day, if the ANC continues to set economic policy, what does it help? The federal government in the Western Cape may be able to administer the ANC's policies a bit more effectively, and if they get law and order and transport, and the police are better run and the transport's better run, that's great. But none of those things are going to, if we're sitting with 50% unemployed because of our economic policies, it isn't really going to help us if we've got an efficient police force and an efficient transport system. We still aren't going to solve our long-term issues. And until we can find a way of giving everybody in the Western Cape or South Africa skin in the game, getting them out of poverty and into employment, we aren't going to solve South Africa's problems. So therefore, the absolute critical requirement is we have to be able to help, particularly those that are disenfranchised, and that is the future to every part of both South Africa and the Western Cape. But we know, unfortunately, that the government of South Africa, in 2019, in the other 8 provinces, 73.1% of voters voted for either the ANC or the EFF, knowing everything they currently know. So South Africa at this point isn't savable, because the voters simply don't want to do what needs to be saved. The Western Cape is in a different situation. It is savable because the voters do want to do what needs to be saved. We just need to be able to allow to go and do it.
Yeah, the counter argument to that, Phil, would be that we have quasi-federalism in South Africa, not really meaningful federalism, that all of our revenue is collected by the National Treasury, the allocations are then distributed to the provinces, and even a province like the Western Cape, which is fairly efficiently run by the DA, they're operating with one hand tied behind their back. They don't control policing, they don't control other aspects of economic policy, as you mentioned. So giving them greater powers would maybe kind of diffuse that tension, that desire for wholesale secession.
Sure. Look. I think my guess is that the Western Cape government wouldn't put Cape independence onto the referendum paper without putting federalism on it too. And I think unquestionably, when they do that, they will get a mandate for federalism that is stronger than the mandate for Cape independence. So from our point of view, we've fully accepted and have no problem that the DA will have the first opportunity to deliver federalism. But I don't see the ANC handing over tax raising powers to a federal Western Cape government, so I think that's going to come to naught. And the difference between federalism and independence is that in independence there is a workaround the South African Constitution. We don't have to have the permission of the South African government in Parliament. We don't need Parliament to vote for Cape independence. There are ways around it. They're not particularly attractive, but ultimately they're available, and that puts us in a different negotiating position. Ironically, federalism's best chance of actually being delivered is being negotiated a compromise from a rampant Cape independence movement, and actually in the face of independence or federalism, that probably is the only opportunity the DA or the Western Cape government have of actually negotiating any meaningful degree of federalism with the national government. So whichever way they cook it, the DA need a strong independence movement. I don't think they've realised that themselves.
Well, Craig, thank you very much for joining me on the Solutions with David Ansara podcast. I thought that this was a really challenging but enjoyable conversation as well. And it really gets down to the heart of what it means to be South African, and also to think critically about the future trajectory of the country and how we solve these many challenges that we're facing in our society. So just wanted to thank you very much for sharing your vision with us, and I certainly will be watching your activities very closely, and look forward to having another conversation with you sometime in the future.
Thanks, David. It's been a real pleasure, and thank you for the opportunity to share my views, and it's good to hear yours too.
If you enjoyed this conversation and you're watching on YouTube, please do give this video a like and also subscribe to the channel. And if you're listening on your preferred podcast platform, please subscribe there as well, and do share this with your friends, family, and others who might be interested. It helps the show to grow. My name is David Ansara. Until next week, take care.